So as I predicted in my video from about a week back, we are now seeing the first of the US's NATO allies balk at having to purchase expensive US military equipment in light of the US's decision to cut off military aid as well as financial aid and intelligence sharing with Ukraine during the Russo-Ukrainian war. So what does this mean going forward for the US and its allies, and how much is this going to cost the US as well as its NATO allies in the next 1 to 2 decades? Privet, my name is Connor Klein. Welcome to Geopolitics with Connor Klein. I'm an expert in international relations, and I've been living in Ukraine for many years, so I'm here to give you a more balanced and nuanced insight into the happenings of the Russo-Ukrainian war. And this is a more general geopolitical video. Let me read out to you what the Público Portuguese newspaper has quoted Portugal's defense minister, Nuno Melo, as saying in Lisbon. He said that they may need to look elsewhere for its fighter modernization initiative. We cannot be oblivious to the geopolitical environment. I'm quoting, Melo says, the recent position of the United States in the context of NATO and at the international geostrategic level has made us think about the best options, because the predictability of our allies is a great asset to take into account. So the issue with Donald Trump turning off the military aid, first of all, they turned off the humanitarian aid and financial aid, then the military aid, they paused it. Technically, Donald Trump cannot actually cut that off completely because that is from money that was allocated by Congress, and they can pause it, but how long can a pause be? But they paused it for a while. At the same time, Russia launched a big counteroffensive in the Kursk area. The Kursk Oblast is a small part of Russia that's currently occupied by Ukraine, and they made significant advances there. US also decided to turn off the intelligence sharing and prevented some private companies with sharing satellite information with Ukraine, which presumably would have allowed them to see better that Russian advance. So it had real consequences on the battlefield. Russia was able to take territory. Now, would they have been able to take it otherwise? Possibly, but definitely didn't help the fact that the US turned it off. And by making that statement that they're willing to turn off intelligence sharing and intel with an ally, even though it's not a NATO ally, in order to try and get Ukraine to basically accept very unfavorable terms for a ceasefire, this has sent alarm bells ringing all across the world, where countries rely on US military equipment, because if the US is willing to shut off this kind of aid to an ally that's under attack, why would countries continue to purchase US military equipment? They have been doing that primarily because the US was such a good ally to Europe since 1945, and obviously before 1945. And with the NATO alliance, they were buying into this whole framework. US supplies basically a nuclear security guarantee for the continent, and in exchange, even though there's no formal tribute that European countries are paying to Washington, they do buy their military equipment from the US. Of course, investing in the US economy, they allow the US to have military bases. There's a whole set of agreements and payments with respect to that. And basically, the US, it's kind of good for both parties. That's why it lasted for so long, in the sense that the US gets a lot of additional military sales and influence, and it's able to forward deploy strategically into Europe via the military bases, and the Europeans don't end up having to spend as much on defense. So basically, it is more efficient. Most of the military equipment is produced in the US, and the US then extends that security guarantee so that the countries aren't duplicating everything overall. However, that era seems to have come to an end with Donald Trump's second term. US allies can no longer realistically rely on the Article 5 Common Defense Clause of the NATO treaty. If, for example, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland were to be attacked, or Finland, by Russia, especially in some sort of plausibly deniable attack like what Russia did in Crimea in 2014, would the US send its soldiers to defend that? Would they use nuclear weapons to defend it? There are a lot of question marks in light of what Donald Trump has said on the campaign trail and how he's treated, in particular, Ukraine since he became president, and also other statements that he's made questioning whether he would actually defend countries in NATO if they're under attack. He did so again last week, most notably. So when he said that if the US is under attack, would these other countries come to defend them, which was particularly scandalous in light of the fact that the only country that's ever invoked Article 5 of NATO is actually the US after September 11, and clearly many other countries in NATO sent assistance and actually went along with basically the US's invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq because they felt like, well, if we don't cover the US and back them now, then maybe they won't back us in the future if we get attacked. There was a lot of the rationale. Unfortunately, they did that, and it doesn't seem with Donald Trump to have done very much. So what we're seeing is the F-35 fighters, Poland, or not Poland, Poland is probably also considering why it would want to buy U.S. military equipment. We also saw actually a spot between Radosław Sikorski, the Polish foreign minister, and Elon Musk and Marco Rubio. Marco Rubio being the U.S. Secretary of State, the foreign minister, this week over whether the Starlink coverage for Ukraine would be cut off by Elon Musk. And Poland basically warned the US against doing that. Again, this is all part of a general feeling that the US is no longer actually allied with its erstwhile European partners. So Portugal, because they haven't actually committed to buying these F-35s, the F-35 is a stealth fighter. It is considered the best, basically. And Portugal at the moment has quite old F-16 fighters. F-16s, you may have heard of that particular fighter because it is what some European countries have sent to Ukraine. It's a US fighter, but it is quite old technology and nothing like the F-35. The F-35 is a massive upgrade. However, because there are also rumors about a potential kill switch, like basically the US would be able to disable an F-35 remotely, whether that's true or not, it's now become a concern that the US would, at the very minimum, maybe not supply parts and software updates for a lot of the technology involved, and this would make them very ineffective very quickly. And that could be used by a hostile US administration against its European allies that have invested, obviously, huge amounts of money into buying these weapon systems. So Portugal has come out and said that they're now reconsidering it, and they will look for basically European alternatives. There isn't going to be something as good, apparently, reading through the military analysis, as an F-35. The French have a Rafale fighter that's not considered as good, but that might be the better option, just looking at it objectively for Portugal, since France is a lot less likely to become hostile to Portugal than the US is under the current White House administration. So how much is this going to cost the US? Well, I made the video last week and I said that with this decision or series of decisions to be hostile to Ukraine and pro-Putin, basically this Putin pivot that Trump has undertaken, it was going to cost the US trillions in the next 1 to 2 decades in terms of lost military sales. The European allies of the US, because they can no longer depend on the US, plus they've got a very aggressive and revanchist Russia on the borders of Russia, has obviously invaded Ukraine and also invaded Georgia in 2008. They are now dramatically increasing their defense spending, so they're going to spend a lot of money. They're probably going to double their budgets over 5 to 10 years. If you look back to 2014 and when they set the 2% guideline for NATO members spent on national defense in light of Russia's invasion of the beginning of the Russo-Ukrainian war and the invasion of Crimea and parts of eastern Ukraine and the Donbass by Russia. This led to a small increase in defense spending across Europe, but in particular in the 3 Baltic states and Poland, it did lead to quite a bit of increased defense spending. And now with this 2022 invasion and the US not looking like it's so committed as in the past to defending its NATO allies, we're going to see that amount of national defense spending absolutely skyrocket. It presumably, like Poland is basically going to go over 5%, it looks like. Same with the Baltic states and many other Western European countries. Some Western European countries are probably going to follow suit, but all countries will be increasing their spending on defense. So they could be literally spending hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars per year on US military equipment. And they are probably not going to do that. European defense companies, their stocks are skyrocketing at the moment because they are likely to be the recipients of much of this defense spending now that countries are going to pivot away from the US in terms of buying their military equipment because they are worried about the US potentially just cutting off supplies and updates and rendering what they buy, because a lot of it is quite sophisticated, completely useless. You'd basically have billions of dollars of military equipment that you wouldn't be able to use potentially in that scenario. So the Putin pivot by the Trump administration is costing literally the US trillions going forward. And I don't even think at this point that maybe a change of policy by the Trump administration or a new administration in 4 years, if it's actually going to be able to completely rectify the situation, even if they said tomorrow they changed their policy, started back Ukraine 100% again, that it would actually be, countries are already going to be suspicious about the US because maybe they flip-flop again, or maybe in the next elections there's even a more openly pro-Putin candidate who wins the election. None of these things can be discounted at this point, so countries are very nervous and they are taking precautions to neutralize the risk that they would be exposing themselves to. Just to give you a little bit of an idea about how much the US actually sells with respect to aircraft, because actually the top line items from last year on foreign military sales from the US, when I look at the State Department's website, was actually the F-16s, not the F-35. The F-35 is there. The F-16s to Turkey, or Turkey as they now insist on calling it in English, F-16s was $23 billion. Israel bought the F-15 and F-15I aircraft for almost 19 billion US dollars. And Romania, they purchased the F-35, they've already committed to it, for 7.2 billion. They must be regretting their decision and looking at, possibly going to look at ways to get out of that contract. So that's just in 1 year, and like just on the aircraft alone, and never mind all the other stuff. I mean, it's well over 100 billion in total, but it's going to be just on the top 3 line items, it's almost 50 billion. Now, those are older aircraft for Turkey and for Israel, but Romania investing 7.2 billion in something that it could be turned off by the US, and they might end up in a situation like Ukraine. So we'll see what's going to happen going forward and how the European arms industry reacts if they dramatically pump up production now, look at increasing their production lines and the sophistication of the military equipment that they are going to be able to supply. But this is what I predicted a week ago. That video got a lot of comments, especially from Trump supporters, saying, oh, only the military industrial complex will lose out. Oh, that's, who cares about that? Well, it has a lot of effects on the US economy if it's going to be trillions of lost military sales, because obviously those munitions are primarily produced in the United States, in factories, by US workers. So all that money that trickles down the US economy, it is going to be going to Europe primarily or somewhere else. And there are other countries outside of Europe that will look for alternatives, like India, for example. And because India had relied a lot on Russian equipment, and Russian equipment doesn't look so good in this war. But are they really going to now buy a lot of US equipment if, especially the more expensive, sophisticated stuff, if that could just be turned off? So the US is going to presumably lose a lot of potential jobs and money and taxes because of that. And on top of it, the actual cost of the US producing its own military equipment, it's actually going to use itself, is now going to be more expensive, because a lot of those research investments you have to make, they can be written off obviously over a lot more individual units of that weapon system. If you're also selling it abroad, that makes it more cost effective to invest into building new weapon systems, but they're not going to be able to do that, as they will inevitably lose a lot of weapon sales. So I'm going to wrap it up with that. Slava Ukraini, as it's written on my t-shirt. And let me know down in the comments below, especially if you are a fan of Donald Trump and his Putin Pivot and MAGA, whether you think that he is such an incredible businessman at this point, if he is taking steps that are going to lose the US trillions and trillions of dollars in weapon sales. Maybe you still think that's a good thing. Let me know your thoughts down below. And Slava Ukraini, do peremоги.